Okay, so let's talk about brain efficiency or why our brains love the routine and familiar. Familiar experiences are highly energy efficient for the brain. A frequently repeated pattern can pretty much run without constant or unconscious monitoring and takes very little energy. However, an unfamiliar experience or something new takes up a lot of energy. Why is this? In part because it presents the brain with conflict. Now, let's stop for a second to define what the word conflict really means to the brain. We tend to think of conflict as meaning like a fight, and in a sense, it is. But conflict is actually defined more simply to the brain. To the brain, conflict is any time an experience is different or does not match what the brain is used to or expecting. And processing conflict or difference is very energy expensive. Neuroscientist Nicole Gravagna describes processing conflict as a bogging down of the brain that steals attention, that steals energy, and steals processing time. Plus, as you'll learn later, the same part of the brain that processes conflict also processes pain. Isn't that interesting? So you can probably see why new and different or anything that requires change can be really uncomfortable or perhaps even outright painful. So once our brains have an established pattern of repeatable, uninterrupted thought or behavior, it becomes part of an energy efficient loop of information. Let's take that same walking example again. When a child first learns to walk, the conscious brain is highly active, assessing each awkward step, like the balance, the distance, and the depth of each body part movement, right? This takes up a lot of energy because it's new and happening consciously. However, once this is repeated enough times and a routine loop of electrochemical and physical signals has been created, the brain's like, I got this. And then that repeated loop gets stored in the unconscious brain to operate automatically and with a lot less energy consumption. Now, later, if that pattern about walking gets interrupted, say you broke your leg or you had a stroke, this new and different experience interrupts the loop. And now walking is back up, taken from the unconscious working state of the brain into the conscious working state of the brain, so it can get tweaked and redesigned with new information as we learn to walk and move with this new injury. That's why it's initially kind of awkward or uncomfortable to learn to walk with crutches or cast, simply because it's different from what the brain is used to, and it takes up far more energy. So the same thing happens with thoughts and behaviors, which is why most of us unconsciously enjoy many of our habits and routines. The more that we do them, the less brain effort they require. They become more comfortable and energy efficient to the brain, just like walking does. But it's also why we can get stuck in some unconscious, unhelpful, habitual thinking and behavior patterns and may not even be aware of it. The same system that creates automatic, unconscious behavior, like walking or eating popcorn while watching a good movie, is the same system that creates automatic thinking habits that lead to emotional response activation and then unwanted behavior. We'll talk more about this in a minute. The tricky part is that for many of us, what we want to get rid of or stop doing is what's become familiar and energy efficient. And what we want to do instead is now what's conflicting to the brain. Even overthinking, that leaves us awake and sleepless at night or running constantly in an anxious state most of the time. Those unwanted patterns are what have become familiar, energy efficient, and easier for the brain to unconsciously maintain. Calm and relaxed is now what's become unfamiliar and different, and therefore is now what's conflicting to the brain when we initially try to do it. Now, understand that this loop creating aspect of your brain, it doesn't have morals or an opinion about what's being automated. It doesn't care if what's ever becoming automated is good for you or not. It's only doing what it's designed to do: create an energy efficient, repeatable pattern. So, this is why even doing something that you know is healthy for you can be extremely challenging and uncomfortable at first. It's simply because it's different from the pattern you already have unconsciously stored. When I try to lose a few pounds and change my diet, say after a winter of less activity and a lot more sweets over the holidays, my brain and body, even over that 3 to 4 months, has adapted to that new weight, that new sweet diet, and that more sedentary lifestyle. Then, when I try to eat cleaner and start more activity come like January, I struggle in the beginning because my brain sees it now as conflicting to what it just automated and made familiar. So, what happens? My stomach growls, my energy level is a bit sluggish as I adjust my sugar intake. And my brain tries to come up with all sorts of stored past excuses because, in that short bit of time, what became familiar and easy for my brain had now switched. And now I have to do the uncomfortable work of switching it back. Hence, the wiser strategy would be not to overindulge so much or let myself become so inactive, because then it takes more work to get it back, right? But I'm human. I like my holiday treats and I'm willing to do the work later. But when I used to be much heavier and I was heavier for a longer period of time, this natural struggle took a bit longer until my brain and body started accepting the new plan. Other behavior patterns are not much different. Is the habit that you want to change interrupting people when they talk? Is the habit you want to change criticizing or judging someone's choices? Are you someone who has been hypervigilant, dwells on the negative, or lives in fear and distrust? Maybe you're a perfectionist or someone who uses their intellect a lot. You'd like to change that. Well, guess what? There's a good chance your brain has adapted those patterns as being familiar and comfortable, and training it to do the opposite, like learning empathy, exercising acceptance, showing appreciation, learning to wonder, accept imperfection, not think so much, express deep connection and love. Those things are now what's become unfamiliar. And therefore, even though we want those things to happen, initially it takes conscious, consistent, intentional effort to work with the brain's natural resistance to what it has stored. Let's put together what we're learning here with what we learned earlier about emotions and feelings, so we can start to see how they link together. So, say we have an experience. As our emotional brain assesses the threat potential and a response starts to activate, our brain checks our unconscious memory to see if we've had this experience before. It's looking for any energy efficient patterns that are already stored and that will help with efficiently predicting a repeatable outcome. Then, based on the unconsciously stored pattern of previous responses, the emotional response either subsides or is accelerated in the body, along with a repeated feeling label that directs the same behavior. And this repeated behavior in turn produces the same energy efficient, yet sometimes undesired outcome. So, in other words, working backwards, we act or behave, right, based on our feelings and emotional response. And those feelings and emotions are influenced by our unconscious thought patterns that are stored deeply and invisibly, kind of in the basement of our brains. Pretty wild, huh? So, if you're wondering of who's running the show, the answer is your past, and your unconsciously stored memory is running the show more often than you think, unless you become aware and consciously take action to intervene and do something uncomfortably different. In other words, unless you pay attention and interrupt the pattern. That was definitely the case for me. Until I identified and brought my unconscious thinking patterns up into my conscious brain, I struggled to consistently get rid of unwanted patterns of behavior. But by increasing my knowledge of the brain and working on self-awareness over time, I was able to pull up more and more of these unconscious automatic thinking patterns and choices right up into the conscious mind and my awareness. That's where I could intentionally make new choices and make the uncomfortable yet desired changes that I wanted. In addition, the more new experiences that I create for my brain to subconsciously register, the more I'm improving the quality of what I call the unconscious reference vault of information that it draws its predictions from. Are you with me? In other words, the brain uses our past experience to predict and direct our current behavior because it's energy efficient. So if we want to change the current behavior that we're doing and that the brain is directing, we need to give it a healthier pool of information to draw from. The more new and supportive thought and behavior experiences that we have, the more new and supportive memory gets created. And over time, that becomes the new and supported reference memory that the brain uses to direct our behavior choice. But we have to introduce new thought and behavior experiences repeatedly and consistently for a brain to make a solid, reliable pathway to this new and supported reference vault of memory. So some of the change work we need to do is here, right? Both in the conscious and subconscious state, which is easier to access and work in. First, we have to consciously tell our brains what we want, which takes effort and intention. But if it's repeated consistently, the subconscious mind will process and package as its new habitual pattern for storage. But once it goes into unconscious storage, it pretty much becomes invisible and difficult to access directly. What we're describing here is new pattern creation. By noticing and interrupting old pattern and behaviors, and then repeatedly introducing new, different, and supportive thought and behavior experiences, we're intentionally creating a new pathway to a new unconscious reference vault, one that's now filled with thought and belief patterns that support the life you want. Excuse me. So with that understanding, can you also see how the brain's love of the familiar can start to work for you and where you can intervene? As we start to get emotionally activated in our bodies, if we become aware of it and intentionally slow down, we can give our conscious brain or our intellect more time to offer more intelligent behavior choices. And it can do so before our emotional response goes into overdrive and we do or say something we might regret. So once you slow down and start noticing those habitual patterns of thought and behavior, you've just taken the first step in breaking those unwanted habits. I did it and I'm still doing it. But it does require a commitment to consistent, conscious effort and repetition, and a willingness to experience some initial discomfort. Why? Because it's new and different. And to the brain, that is energy expensive conflict. But the brain's love of the familiar can also work for you. For me, within several months of consistent, conscious repetition, the changes I wanted to see started to take less and less effort and less energy. I initially had to put a lot of conscious effort, energy, and intention into noticing my body signals, creating new brain pathways, and working through some real, naturally occurring discomfort. But once repeated enough times without falling back into old routine, my brain eventually adopted the new pattern as its new normal and went about doing what it does best, making it more automatic and energy efficient. And I'm still experiencing new patterns of thought and behavior today. So now you understand that when a desired behavior is initially uncomfortable, it's actually a signal that you're finally making some real change happen in your brain. It's kind of wild, right? Now, although this influence of our unconsciously and subconsciously stored thought patterns is a crucial part of sustainable change, I believe it's only part of what creates integrative and brain strengthening change. This is where many cognitive approaches fall short. We can begin our transformative work in a second by changing our thoughts in the moment. But for it to stick and become automated in our emotional and behavioral responses requires repeated pattern interruption over time. And for us to be able to fully use our brains as an integrated whole requires intentional use and strengthening of areas of our brain that have gotten weak. So let's review. We all love routines that are familiar because they're highly energy efficient for the brain. Conflict to the brain is anything that is different or does not match what the brain is expecting or used to. Once the brain has a pattern that is repeated enough times, it gets stored in the unconscious brain to be referenced and run automatically. The brain's love of familiarity is both a blessing and an obstacle. For some things, we love the ease and comfort of routine and familiarity, right? But it also makes it a challenge to get rid of the behaviors we don't want anymore. The best way to start working with the brain's natural resistance to change is to slow down and become more aware of your patterns. However, with commitment and repetition, changes in the brain also become more energy efficient. So, said another way, this brain characteristic that once was an obstacle then becomes a facilitator of change. Isn't that interesting? You're basically changing the role of the brain from that of a defender of old habits to that of a facilitator of your new habits. The opponent becomes the ally. Isn't that cool that we can do that to our brains? I think so. Let's move on.